my former career. It's been so long since I was involved as an academic. Yes, I was actually teaching at a number of universities, at Australian National University and also American University and George Washington University in Washington DC, and I was pretty much set on an academic career, and I was doing pretty well, getting grants and so forth from different organisations. And then I came across a video that was created by Dr. Stephen Greer of the Disclosure Project press conference in Washington DC in 2001, and it changed my life. I mean, really it did. I shifted from being an international scholar looking at international conflict and what are the sources of conflict and trying to resolve these things, to exploring the things that a lot of academics view as kind of like conspiracy and you know, just out of left field. They're not really interested in it, but to me it was very compelling, and I have that happened in 2001, and by 2004 the university had kind of thrown me out of the system. I was spat out of the system. I didn't fit in any longer. It's like I was now persona non grata, and I forged a career in exopolitics, and thankfully things are coming around now where all of a sudden this kind of material that I've been studying for the last, since 2001, is now starting to be taken seriously. And so it's very gratifying to see the change. And this morning I woke up with a really, something that I thought was a joke, but then I realized that it wasn't a joke, it was very serious. I actually live in Hawaii, on the big island of Hawaii. And last time I was here with my wife, but she's now in Hawaii looking after the cat, and at 8:10 a.m. Hawaiian time, she and everyone else in the Hawaiian Islands with a smartphone got the following message. Extreme alert, 8:07 a.m. January 13, ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Type extreme alert. Quite a shock. And for 20 minutes, you know, I guess she was looking for shelter from a nuclear missile attack from wherever. So I don't know how you find shelter during a nuclear missile attack. Someone might know. And then 20 minutes later, the official kind of emergency alert system kind of went into gear saying, well, it was just a mistake. You know, there's no nuclear attack, no ballistic missile incoming. And it's like, just a mistake. It's like, really? Just a mistake? I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was a warning, or a threat against the US military, against the national security system in the US, which is following a very different path to previous presidential administrations. And actually it does kind of lead into what I'm going to be finishing off today with, in terms of this present administration in the United States, and why it is that their policies could have precipitated this kind of warning, this kind of threat. I mean, Hawaii was attacked during the Second World War. Everyone knows about Pearl Harbor, and Hawaii really is a military garrison, and US Pacific Command is located there, and actually US Pacific Command oversees Antarctica. So that's based in Honolulu. So what may be happening? What is going on that could lead to this extraordinary threat against, you know, the Hawaiian Islands and this present administration? What are they doing? So this is what I'm going to be leading into, but there's a lot of background that I'm going to fill in. We have, I think, 4 hours. We're going to have 2 hours. We're going to go till about 3, then we'll have a half-hour break, and then I'll resume. So I'll try and leave about half an hour at the end for questions. Got about 120 slides to go through. But I think at the end of it all, you'll get a good idea of the history of Antarctica and how it is relevant to the whole idea of secret space programs, and why it may, in some way, may tie in to what happened this morning in Hawaii. So let's kind of start with the exploded planet hypothesis. which is a theory that was proposed by Dr. Thomas van Flandern back in the early, I think it was the year 2000. And he basically was making the case, looking at all the scientific data, that when you look at the asteroid belts, both the inner asteroid belt, the one between Jupiter and Mars, and the one out in the Kuiper belt, or Kuiper belt, that when you look at the various masses of the bodies and the trajectories and so forth, that as an astronomer, he basically calculated that there were former planets there, that the asteroid belts, inner and outer asteroid belts, are the debris from former planets that had catastrophic events. And so one of the things that he proposed was that the planet Mars actually was a moon of this exploded planet in the asteroid belt, in the inner asteroid belt. And so he has come up with a list of reasons for why it is that Mars was a moon of this planet that was in the inner asteroid belt. And he goes through a number of factors there. There's quite a list. I don't want to kind of spend too much time on this, but if you're interested, just type in exploded planet hypothesis and you'll come up with a paper by Dr. Thomas van Flandern, and it'll go through the reasons he gives, such as one side of Mars having more evidence of asteroid impacts, and that the crust is much thicker in one part of Mars, in the southern region of Mars, than the northern region. That the southern region of Mars, the southern hemisphere, is the crust is about 20 kilometres thick, but the northern hemisphere is only 1 kilometre thick. So, and then you look at the evidence of asteroid impacts, and it's the southern hemisphere which has more debris. And you can see from this map of Mars that the southern hemisphere is very different to the northern hemisphere, as though there had been some catastrophic event that caused Mars to show these characteristics. And so Thomas van Flandern's thesis was that while Mars was this former moon of this planet that was destroyed in the asteroid belt, and that Mars itself is evidence of this catastrophic event that happened many hundreds of thousands or even millions of years ago. So, this is an incredible, this is quite a thesis, and certainly Thomas van Flandern was a very respected naval astronomer. He was the chief of the Naval Observatory in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, was it factual or not? Well, what we do know is that the CIA was very interested in this thesis, because the CIA actually tasked a remote viewer, a very talented remote viewer by the name of Joseph McGonigal, to actually remote view Mars to the time of some catastrophic event. The CIA was interested. So if this was just some way out theory proposed by a former astronomer, then why would the CIA be employing remote viewers to look into Mars' past and to find out what happened in on Mars? These are documents that were released from the CIA. They have a website, it's called CREST, or on their website they have an archive of FOIA documents that they call CREST, and that details various historic documents, FOIA documents that are of interest to the CIA, and this was one of them, that the CIA was interested in remote viewing of Mars in the ancient past and of the inhabitants of Mars. So, and in this document, this particular document, it basically, the remote viewer discusses seeing these beings, these Martians, these ancient Martians, actually evacuating the planet, that Mars was being evacuated. It was some planetary catastrophe, corresponding to the what I earlier discussed the exploding planet hypothesis, that they were escaping some planetary catastrophe. So maybe this was after the catastrophe. Mars was no longer sustainable. You know, maybe the atmosphere was blown out or was in the process of being lost. If you can think about it, if Mars was a thriving planet at the time and one half of Mars was obliterated by catastrophic asteroids, comets coming from this exploded planet, the other half of Mars, they would have had more time to evacuate. Obviously, a planetary catastrophe, you don't have much time. And so this is what apparently the remote viewer tuned into, that these people were evacuating the planet. And they had they had big arcs that were taking them away. And what's interesting is some of the references here allude to the Martians escaping to another planet. And so here you have, MON is the monitor. And he says, okay, when the others left, these people are waiting. When the others left, how did they go? He's talking about the Martians. So the remote viewer is looking at the Martians. And the subject, that's Joseph McGonigal, he says, get an impression of don't know what the hell it is. It looks like the inside of a larger boat, very rounded walls and shining metal. So this is some kind of ark, some kind of mothership taking the Martians off planet. So the monitor says, go along with them on their journey and find out where it is they go. So, where did the fleeing Martians go? So the subject, impression of a really crazy place with volcanoes and gas pockets and strange plants. Very volatile place. It's very much like going from the frying pan into the fire. Difference is there seems to be a lot of vegetation where the other place did not have it, and different kind of storms. So, the document goes on and on, but definitely if you're interested in that, just type in CREST, CIA, remote viewing, and you'll see it, that document that's available by the CIA. So the CIA was very interested in remote viewing. It considered remote viewing as something that actually provided valid intelligence. There have been estimates of around 80% of remote viewing is accurate for people like McGonigal who are top, in that top tier. So 80% accuracy is pretty good. So basically what he's saying is that the Martians escaped to some planet, to some place that was very volcanic. Okay, where could that have been? And Earth, obviously, is a prime candidate. I mean, we know Venus today is a hot house. If Mars was in the orbit of this planet that had been destroyed in the asteroid belt, where could they have gone? They could have gone to some of the moons of Jupiter. Possibly there they could have found an environment that could have hosted them, or Earth. And Earth, whenever this happened, was a place that possibly could have been a refuge for the Martians. Well, where would they have gone? And where on Earth would there have been lots of volcanoes? Well, this is where we get into Antarctica. The scientists very recently, only last year, confirmed that the world's largest volcanic system is in Antarctica. And so there you have, the red dots represent all of the 91 volcanoes that were discussed, that were discovered last year. There have been others that have been previously discovered, but with that 91 that was just discovered last year, it made Antarctica the most active volcanic region on the planet. More active than East Africa, which was previously where they thought where the most extensive volcanic fields were. So this takes us to the big question. Did the Martians, refugees, settle in Antarctica 60,000 years ago? According to Corey Good, how many people don't know of Corey Good? If you just raise your hand if you don't know of him. Okay, just a few of you. I talked about him last time I was here in 2016. He's a whistleblower who's gotten quite a lot of attention. He's become very controversial, and people kind of like either strongly believing that every word he says is true and others that believe it's a fraud. But nevertheless, he has a lot of people that are looking at his claims, and I've been studying him now since March of 2015, and in that, this is coming on 3 years, I haven't found any reason for me to kind of like say that his information is suspect in any way. It holds up with the data, you know. I mean, he was talking about a massive volcanic system in Antarctica long before scientists talked about it. And so this is just one more piece of evidence corroborating what he has said in the past. So one of the things he said in the past was that the Martian refugees settled in Antarctica about 60,000 years ago. And so this is an illustration of the information that he has about these Martian refugees, how they looked, kind of like a humanoid appearance, roughly 12 to 14 foot tall, quite thin, with elongated skulls. So that's a representation of them, and that they chose to make Antarctica their home base. That in fact that they crash landed on Antarctica. In terms of, there were 3 large motherships that crash landed in Antarctica. Antarctica, the continent, the size of the continent, is twice the size of Australia. So we're talking about a vast land. And it's not just Corey Goode that has talked about 3 motherships landing in Antarctica with the artefacts from an ancient civilization. Dr. Pete Peterson is another whistleblower who's talked about also being exposed to this information and also seeing this. That today, Corey Goode and Pete Peterson are the only 2 people who say that they've actually travelled into the interior of Antarctica, that they've been taken there, and actually witnessed the artefacts of the debris from these motherships, the extraterrestrial civilization that's there. So definitely worth looking at their information to see how relevant it is. Now, one of the things that Corey Goode said is that these Martian refugees that crash landed in Antarctica, that they began establishing worldwide colonies where they created elite bloodlines, that they interbreeded or used their genetics to alter the local humans to create a derivative race or a hybrid race. So, you know, in that previous picture on the left, on your left, that's one of the Martians, according to Goode, 12 to 14 foot tall, and on the right is one of the hybrids, roughly 8 foot tall, 9 foot tall, elongated skull. So, is there evidence that this could have happened historically? Do we have any evidence of these these Martian refugees coming in, ruling over humanity, establishing colonies, and then establishing, after some period of time, hybrids in positions of authority over the rest of humanity? Is there evidence for this, historical evidence? If this is part of our hidden history, do we know of anyone talking about this? In fact, there is. There's quite a bit. We have Manetho, an ancient Greek, ancient historian, Egyptian historian, that talked about successive waves of rulers. He talked about the age of the gods, that there were, firstly, there were the gods who behaved like gods. They were considered by ancient humans beings of divine origin, which is the source of the divine right of kings. That has been an idea that up until the 17th century was how humanity had organised itself. That the gods first ruled, and they lived for tens of thousands of years. Then they were followed by the demigods, and that these were beings who lived shorter lives, thousands of years, centuries, many centuries. Then it talked about the spirits of the dead and the mortal kings who ruled Egypt down to Darius, king of the Persians. So basically you have Manetho, and the ancient Egyptians actually recognised that there was this lineage of gods down to demigods, and then down to humans. And you actually have a similar thing in the Sumerian tradition, where the Sumerians talked about, or there's a document called the King's List, and similarly, this idea of first you have the gods, demigods, and then humans ruling over the rest of humanity. Well, if we replace the word gods by extraterrestrials and replace the word demigods by hybrids, what we have is essentially what Corey Goode was describing. First, you have your refugees, Martian refugees arriving, establishing colonies, and then you have your hybrids, and then you have humans. More evidence that this happened. In the book of Enoch, you have actually references to these extraterrestrials. Now, the book of Enoch refers to them as fallen angels. And the book of Enoch says, and the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them, talking about women, and they said to one another, come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the children of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. And they were in all 200, and they came down on the summit of Mount Hermon. So Mount Hermon is at the kind of corner of Syria and Palestine, Israel, and that it's obviously a mountain, and that these fallen angels, or Martian refugees, if you like, basically came down and began to interbreed with humans. They began genetic experiments. So the Bible talks about this, and these the hybrids were called the Nephilim, which basically means giants. And there are many, many references to giants in ancient scriptures. And so you have this same idea of some kind of extraterrestrial intervention and leading to different types of rulers. First the extraterrestrials, then the hybrids, and then the humans themselves, the rest of humanity. So, you know, where was the kind of hub of this civilization, you know, that was global, that was established by these refugees, by these extraterrestrials that were now living amongst humanity? Well, according to Corey Goode, he says that that was in Antarctica, but that 13,000 years ago, because of a catastrophic event called the pole shift, that Antarctica moved from being in a temperate place on the planet to where it currently is, in the South Pole. Now, it's historical fact that North America, 13,000 years ago, was covered by massive ice sheets. So it's quite possible that the North Pole was in North America, was in that area. And that's why North America was covered by these massive ice sheets, and that the South Pole was somewhere else other than where it currently is, in Antarctica. And that Antarctica itself was in a temperate region of the planet. Well, the pole shift theory, that was proposed by Charles Hapgood, and in his thesis was that the poles, kind of like the geographic poles, that they move, that they shift over certain periods of time. And his theory in the 1950s was actually supported by none other than Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein wrote the foreword to his book, Path of the Pole, and Einstein said that this theory actually makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of data supporting it. So Einstein thought it was very plausible. And in Path of the Pole, he just kind of lays out the theory for the Earth's shifting crust. But one of the things that Charles Hapgood also did was he wrote another book called The Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And in that book, he talked about ancient maps like the Piri Reis map and the Orontius Phineus maps, ancient maps that dated from the 16th century, that referred to much older maps that showed Antarctica as ice-free. So this kind of these maps actually support this idea that at one point in its recent history, before this catastrophic pole shift 13,000 years ago, Antarctica was ice-free. It was somewhere out in a temperate region of the planet. And here you can see Australia was probably a lot closer to the South Pole. So that's the thesis of Charles Hapgood. Well, is there any evidence that Antarctica was this place that was once temperate, and that it was the base for the extraterrestrials or the extraterrestrial refugees that established worldwide colonies, and that this was their technological hub? According to Good, the basis for this worldwide extraterrestrial civilization, its hub was Antarctica. So now we get to this idea that Antarctica now is affected by this pole shift, and now there's a catastrophic shift, an event that moves Antarctica into its present location under the South Pole. So if it was a hub for an extraterrestrial colony that had established outposts all over the world, now all of a sudden its hub was located in Antarctica, or in the South Pole region, and so now you have massive ice sheets starting to form over what was once a thriving temperate land. So is there any evidence for this? Well, in fact, the Book of Enoch actually makes a reference to a place that appears to be Antarctica. So the Book of Enoch, what does it say? It says 18.5, chapter 18, section 18.5, and I saw the winds on the earth which support the clouds, and saw the paths of the angels. I saw at the end of the earth the firmament of heaven above. 18.6, and I went towards the south, and it was burning day and night. So Enoch is describing the journey he was taken in this war between different angels. There were the fallen angels, what I'm considering to be these extraterrestrial refugees from Mars, and then there were the righteous angels, which today we would basically consider them to be this a consortium of another group of extraterrestrial colonizers, extraterrestrial genetic engineers who have been manipulating human DNA for many hundreds of thousands of years. So, maybe that's something I can talk more about during the question time. But for now, the Book of Enoch describes this conflict between these two groups of extraterrestrials, or two groups of angels, and that Enoch was chosen as an intermediary, and he was basically taken down to the south to view what was going on. And for those that follow the Corey Goode material, there are kind of eerie parallels between what Enoch described in the Book of Enoch with what has been happening with Corey Goode, because he also describes himself as being this kind of intermediary between different extraterrestrial factions, that the name he's been given by one of the extraterrestrial groups actually refers to Enoch. So, and Corey Goode actually says he was taken down to Antarctica. So Enoch was taken down to this place in the south. And he said, 18.6, and I was taken to the south, and it was burning day and night. Well, where does sunlight burn day and night? North Pole, South Pole. Where there were 7 mountains of precious stones, 3 towards the east and 3 towards the south. And those towards the east were of coloured stone, and one was of pearl, and one of healing stone. Those towards the south of red stone. And the middle one reached to heaven, like the throne of the Lord of Stubium, and the top of the throne was of sapphire. So he's referring to 7 mountains, and at the middle mountain of this chain was the largest. So is there a place in Antarctica that refers to this? Well, indeed there is. The Mount Vinson is the tallest mountain in Antarctica, and right next to it, on either side, are three very large mountains that form this kind of mountain range, or the Mount Vinson Massif, as it's also called. And so there you have a diagram that shows the three mountains in alignment, pointing to the south before the pole shift, and the others pointing east before the pole shift. There's an Israeli alternative news source, Ben Nur, I think his first name might be Joseph Ben Nur, but he was the first one to start talking about this, and he identified Antarctica as being the place that was being referred to in the Book of Enoch. So here you have the idea that Antarctica is a place where the fallen angels, as described in the Book of Enoch, are buried. They're imprisoned. And that's very similar to what Corey Good says that he learned through his inside sources and from his years in the secret space program, where he says he had access to these smart glass pads where he saw information about these extraterrestrials who were basically in stasis chambers on these motherships buried under the Antarctic ice shelf. So that was what he says he saw, and so here you have some historic documents that corroborate that give this idea a possibility that it is real, that you can actually have under the Antarctic ice shelf massive extraterrestrial motherships with advanced technologies that were used at one time to establish a global civilization that were ruled by these beings, but that during a catastrophic Earth event, a pole shift, all of this technology was now buried under the Antarctic ice. So here you have a map that shows where Mount Vinson is in relationship to the rest of Antarctica. Here you have a map that shows where Mount Vinson is in relationship to an ice-free Antarctica. So prior to the pole shift, this worldwide extraterrestrial culture and the mountain range that is associated with it, you can see that it would have been accessible through ocean navigation, normal means. And that mountain range, which is now covered by ice, would have, especially if it was, had a lot of metal alloys, as the Book of Enoch described, pearl and sapphire and so forth, it would have looked quite impressive from the ocean, because it would have just been a massive mountain chain kind of coming out of the ocean, and you could have sailed right up. So this is quite possibly how this extraterrestrial outpost or refugee post could have been covered by ice. And now, of course, everything of interest is buried under the ice, whereas previously it would have been on land right next to this mountain range. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of the ancient history. We're still trying to get information to corroborate all of this. So far, there are historical texts that corroborate some of this information. Next, we're going to look at more recent events that date back to just prior to the Second World War, when Germany began to become very interested in Antarctica. Nazi Germany, actually in 1936, actually developed a four-year economic plan, and it referred to the colonization of Antarctica. Because in 1936, Germany hosted the Olympic Games. Nazi Germany was wanting to restore its former grandeur. Now, there was no possibility that it could retake its former colonies that it lost after the First World War. So where on earth could the Germans go to re-establish themselves as a great power and establish colonies? The most remote region on the planet, which was Antarctica. So in 1936, the Germans actually began a colonization plan for Antarctica. And it took them a few years, but eventually they got to launched an expedition in 1938, 39, and they went down there and they were mapping Antarctica, and they were claiming it. They were claiming a region of Antarctica for Nazi Germany that would basically establish colonies in Antarctica. So this was the plan, and one of the things that history hasn't kind of revealed or shown, or it's been covered up. So that was the 1938 expedition, led by Captain Alfred Richter. And so this is the Schwabenland, which was a kind of small aircraft carrier launching a Dornier Super Wal, I guess a kind of propeller-driven airplane, in 1939 to kind of like start mapping Antarctica and dropping kind of German flags to claim Antarctica. So this was a colonization of Antarctica. But it wasn't just launching planes and dropping flags over Antarctica. That was the extent of what the Germans were doing there. They were actively seeking suitable habitats for German colonists. So they were looking, and there were places, the Germans found ice-free areas in Antarctica. Today they're known as kind of desert oases. Typically they are in areas surrounded by mountains, large mountain ranges that prevent the ice sheet from going into these ice-free areas. So there are ice-free areas, and the Germans did discover these. And the Germans did discover large caverns in Antarctica. And that these were places that they could begin to establish colonies. Because what the Germans found out once they began to explore these large caverns, and this has only recently been acknowledged, was that many of these large caverns were thermally warmed. That they were warm enough to establish colonies, that they weren't frozen, they weren't inhospitable to life. You could go into these cavern systems and it was warm enough. 25 degrees Celsius is what has been recently discovered in terms of how warm some of these caverns were. So very large caverns were discovered. They were suitable, they were large enough and suitable for the Germans to begin establishing colonies. And some of these some of these underground or under ice caverns could be reached through submarines. This was one of the things that the Germans were able to discover, that under the ice sheet there were waterways into the interior of Antarctica. So they used these different ways of establishing colonies in Antarctica using the natural cavern systems there that are thermally heated. And earlier on I mentioned the vast volcanic system in Antarctica, and this is what basically is able to warm extensive networks of caverns and lava tubes throughout Antarctica underneath. And so there's a lot of areas in Antarctica which is suitable for human habitation. One of the things that hasn't been kind of generally acknowledged, but more and more we're getting the mainstream media talking about this. So the next important thing to consider here is that the United States knew what the Germans were up to. They wanted to make sure that the Germans didn't violate the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was the idea that when it came to the Western Hemisphere, that Europeans weren't allowed, that they couldn't come in and establish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And so the Western Hemisphere is traditionally seen to be North and South America, Central America. That's considered to be the Western Hemisphere, and that the United States has basically told Europe through the Monroe Doctrine, which was issued under President Monroe in the, when was it, the 19th century, that this was hands-off. So the United States wanted to make sure that when the Germans were establishing their colonies in Antarctica, that they weren't violating the Monroe Doctrine and going into the western regions of Antarctica, which was considered by the United States to be part of the Western Hemisphere. So here you have newspaper reports about Admiral Byrd, Richard Byrd, being ordered to go down to Antarctica and lead an expedition to find out where the Germans were establishing their colonies. Where were the Germans establishing their bases? This was what Admiral Byrd was given orders to do. So here you have a newspaper report from July 7, 1939, ordering Byrd for the summer, the Antarctic summer of 39 and 40, to go down to Antarctica. Now, of course, by September 1st, the Second World War had started. But nevertheless, Byrd did go down there. And the Nazi bases had been established in Queen Maud Land, which was in the eastern portion of Antarctica. So they weren't violating the Monroe Doctrine, so the Americans basically felt that they didn't have any reason to kind of interfere with what the Germans were doing in Queen Maud Land, which is here, the red marked area. And this up here is an atlas, and the atlas shows the kind of the area that the Germans were claiming. This was a map of Neuschwabenland that was, during the Second World War, highly confidential. This wasn't released to scholars. It was only after the Second World War that it was released, the Sudeten Atlas that was used by the German military. And so you can see that they have distinct meridians, and this meridian here going right through Neuschwabenland, that extends up to Europe, up to Germany. And so this is very important because it gives you the grid coordinates for how the Germans could navigate through, send their ships and submarines down to Antarctica and actually enter into, under the ice shelf, go into the Antarctic cavern system where they could establish bases. So, this shows you again where the region where the Germans had established their bases or had claimed them. And base 21 was under the Müller-Hoffmann mountain range. So that was built around 1942-43. So how was this possible? How could they have done this? Well, under the Antarctic ice shelf, you have a massive network of rivers, waterways, and lakes right throughout Antarctica. So just as in North America right now, I mean, the Great Lakes in North America are frozen over. Niagara Falls, most recent news I got was that Niagara Falls had frozen. So that you get, this is the way waterways operate during extreme cold times. You get the surface freezing, and but underneath the water continues to flow. So the same thing happened in Antarctica. So when Antarctica was covered over by the ice sheets, when it was moved into the South Pole region, what once were extensive water systems, waterways, extending from the interior mountain ranges all the way down to the coastline, now all of a sudden these are under the ice shelf, but they're still navigable for submarines. And this is exactly how the Germans were able to navigate underneath the ice sheets. So here again you have Queen Maud Land, where the Germans had, and here you have the route, one of the routes that they could have taken. The blue regions under the Antarctic ice is below the ice, the surface, and so this is where you could have, submarines could have navigated into the interior of Antarctica, and all along those water routes there were cavern systems that they could have chosen to build. And according to some of the sources that I've come across, there were at least 2 very large cavern systems that were used. That another whistleblower that I'll be talking about shortly, William Tompkins, says that the Germans were guided to two very large cavern systems. And I'll talk shortly about who was helping the Germans find these cavern systems. Here you have the instructions for German U-boat captains to navigate the ice sheets to navigate under the ice sheets. So you have the kind of the terrain, the depth, what's underneath the ice sheets, the mountain ranges and so forth. And this is where the German submarines could navigate through that. This gives you the coordinates of where in Antarctica's coastline the submarines could navigate from into the interior. So these are the actual instructions. They've been translated, and that's how it looks. It basically tells us, or tells the German U-boat captains to first they have to go to the exact intersection of the 64th southern latitude and 1 degree eastern longitude to a depth of 400 meters. So this is right by the Queen Maud land that was claimed by the Germans, very close to that zero meridian that the German Navy had decided. And that was the German Navy that was in charge of all of this. And it gives you the instructions for the U-boat captains to go down and find what they called Agartha. That's what they called the bases that they had established under the Antarctic ice. And soon I'll talk more about Agartha and who the Agarthans were, that these were, that the Germans were actually being helped by multiple advanced cultures that had a presence in Antarctica to go down to Antarctica. So that's how they were able to find these bases in Antarctica. Now, according to William Tompkins, and just to kind of mention a little bit of background about Bill Tompkins, I have a book written that's about Bill Tompkins' testimony. It's called the US Navy's Secret Space Program. And Bill Tompkins, he worked for the US Navy from 1940, from 42 to 46 as a covert operative at Naval Air Station San Diego, where his job was to debrief Navy spies that had embedded themselves in Nazi Germany in the advanced aerospace programs to find out what the Germans were up to in terms of advanced aerospace programs. And so Tompkins' job was to be part of the debriefings of these Navy spies. He said there were nearly 30 of them, but about 29. And that once he debriefed them, then his job was to put together briefing packets that he would take off to various scientific institutions, think tanks, military laboratories, anyone within the United States that was capable of understanding the kind of advanced technologies that the Germans were up to. And the US Navy was basically monitoring all of this and finding out what the Germans were doing. And that one of the things that the Navy spies were reporting about was that the Germans were taking these, were building out these very large bases in Antarctica and taking lots of personnel, lots of resources using these very large submarines. And here he says, quote, they were telling us about he's talking about the Navy spies, they were telling us about the incredible things that we were learning about what Nazi Germany was doing with high technology vehicles and how their Navy had secretly developed 400 passenger submarines and was using them to take their advanced technology to Antarctica. So they were taking a lot of equipment, a lot of resources and a lot of personnel down to Antarctica to establish colonies. So to establish colonies, you don't just need hard-working men, you also need good-looking Sheilas, right? And the Nazi SS had a program where they recruited the best-looking Sheilas in Nazi Germany, or occupied Europe, and they actually sent them down to Antarctica. That this was this was the plan. They're establishing a colony. This was going to be the new future, that this was what Germany was going to pin its future on, this Antarctic colony, because of the harsh conditions, that this was going to like really push people to the limits. And out of those, once the limits were pushed, you would have the Aryan Superman emerging. So Antarctica was the breeding place for the Aryan Superman, or superwomen. And so they got lots of German breeding stock from occupied territories, including Ukrainians. So there were 10,000 Ukrainian women that were recruited for Antarctica. And so the ratio was, they would have like 4 to 1. So that they had their Waffen SS soldiers that would go down there, and that there would be a breeding program to basically build a kind of these warriors, these Aryan super soldiers down in Antarctica. So this is where the first super soldier program began in Antarctica. And that the Nazi SS played a role in all of this, because they actually were mapping genetics. I mean, they were breeding people based on genetics, and they were trying to breed this super Aryan. And this was a legitimate program, or a program that was officially underway in Nazi Germany. There were also lots of missing scientists and U-boats at the end of the World War II, which showed that this kind of massive program was underway, that just large numbers of people were missing. 54 U-boats, 6,000 technicians and scientists were missing from Germany. The SS technical branch especially, this was kind of like the equivalent of America's Area 51, maybe Pine Gap in Australia. I don't know where they build the Australian Flying Saucer fleet. Talked a little bit about that last time, but definitely the Germans had their own Area 51, and that was run by the Nazi SS. They also used slave labour. Unfortunately, the Germans, the Nazis, arrived at the conclusion that the best way of maintaining secrecy was to use slave labour. That when you used ordinary labour, normal German workers or people that had been recruited, that this led to operational failures or security failures, which is why the building of the V1 and V2 rockets shifted from the War Armaments Ministry under Albert Speer during World War II, from Peenemünde down to the Harz Mountains, which was now under the Nazi SS, because the Nazi SS said, no, German workers, you're going to have lapses in security, slave labour, they're all expendable, we'll keep the secrets. And that's one of the unfortunate legacies of this German colonization program in Antarctica, was that they perpetuated slave labour down there. 40,000 slave labourers and 140 to 250,000 German citizens that were taken down there. So, could the Germans have pulled this off? Could they have built large cavern systems in Antarctica? Well, we do know as a historical fact that the Germans did actually succeed in building vast underground complexes in Nazi Germany to escape the Allied bomber raids. That during this, at the height of the Second World War, there were like 1,000 bombers flying over Germany, bombing all their industrial infrastructure. So the Germans realised that if they were to continue the war effort, that they had to build underground, and they became experts in it. So here's one entrance to the Mittelwurz in Nordhausen, which is where the V rockets were built. That's in the Harz Mountain range. And they had a vast underground complex where they had accommodation for slave labourers, the industrial laboratories, building plants, a railway system to ship the V1, V2 rockets to railroads, taking them to wherever it was that they were going to be launched. So this was vast. So it hosted all of the workers, the scientists, the security. And this was all led by a Nazi SS general by the name of Hans Kammler. And just down the very bottom here, you can see Kammler. This is an Intelligence Objectives Committee report, so it's an official document that acknowledges that the underground facilities in Nazi Germany had been taken out of the hands of Albert Speer, who was in charge of the armaments ministry in Nazi Germany, and transferred into the hands of the Nazi SS, and the SS had appointed this general, Lieutenant General Kammler. So it says here, Kammler, a high SS leader known to be in charge of underground plant construction, and according to Rosenberg, also in charge of the V1 and V2 programs, was also said to have had his headquarters ill-filled. So this acknowledges that Hans Kammler was in charge of the underground facilities in Nazi Germany. Okay, well, that's significant because the same man, Kammler, was using those skills for building, later for building or expanding the underground facilities in Antarctica. And we know that this was something that could have happened because later on in the 1960s, Hans Kammler shows up at the Kennedy Space Center. Clark McClellan, down the bottom, he is a former spacecraft operator. He spent 34 years working for various NASA contractors and finished his career as a spacecraft operator, which is like a ground astronaut. So he was trained like an astronaut so that he could advise the astronauts on how they could fly their space shuttle missions or missions into, at that time he was involved in the space shuttle program. So he saw Hans Kammler at the Kennedy Space Center in the office of the director of the Kennedy Space Center, Kurt Debus, who himself was a former Nazi, and I'll talk a little bit about why former Nazis seem to occupy such senior positions in the American space program. So he sees Kammler there in 1960s, which shows that Kammler continued to operate well after the end of the Second World War. That if they had these massive underground construction programs in Antarctica, that Kammler would very likely have been involved. And in the 1960s, that the United States somehow had reached an accommodation with these Nazis in Antarctica. So I'll talk about that shortly. The slave labour was used in the Antarctic bases. Kind of already mentioned that this was something that was part of the Nazi ideology. Now, William Tompkins, he says that during the Second World War that the Nazis had developed 30 prototypes of flying saucer craft. And so you have some of these prototypes displayed here. What Tompkins points out, though, is that not all of these prototypes were successful. Some of them were unsuccessful. And that these unsuccessful, the successful flying saucer prototypes were taken down to Antarctica, into the underground facilities there, and the unsuccessful prototypes and the scientists, engineers that had worked on the unsuccessful prototypes were left in occupied Europe to kind of like survive the end of the Second World War as best they can. So during the war, all the successful prototypes and the scientists and engineers that built them and the companies that were involved in building them, they moved all these resources down to Antarctica to continue building these successful prototypes, and the others were kind of like left behind. So you have, in 1950, you have a few of the Italian and German engineers that had been involved in some of the unsuccessful prototypes coming forward and saying, yeah, we worked on flying saucer projects during the Second World War. Some of the unsuccessful prototypes used jet engines. That the Germans understood that the secret for building flying saucers was using torsion field physics, in other words, generating a very powerful high frequency rotation. So if you could spin an object around quickly enough that it could generate a torsion field, and that would kind of like create a space-time effect or have an anti-gravity effect. So this is what the Germans were working on, and so they had many brilliant engineers, scientists trying to come up with ways to generate spin as quickly as possible so that you could rotate these flying saucers so that they could generate the anti-gravity effect. And so this was one of the techniques, was using jet engines. So, and the Germans were experts in pioneering jet engine, jet propulsion. And so they used this, but it was unsuccessful. And there were others that were similarly not successful, and that people have come out and spoken about. And this has been, there have been a number of authors that have spoken about these unsuccessful flying saucer programs, or the ones that appeared to be semi-successful in terms of testing and so forth. Renato Vesca, he's written some books called, one book, Intercept But Don't Shoot. That might not be the exact title, but Intercept, Don't Shoot, I think was the first title. Henry Stevens has talked about it. Joseph Farrell has talked about these flying saucer programs, and there have been a number of intelligence documents that come from the FBI, the CIA, which corroborate that, yes, this was happening. Germany was working on these programs. But what most UFO historians who have looked at Nazi Germany and its construction of flying saucer programs have overlooked is that the Germans were able to take the successful prototypes down to Antarctica. So that's where we have, you know, a difference between, you know, what William Tompkins and Corey Goode and I'm saying compared to what Henry Stevens, Joseph Farrell, Renato Vesca and others are saying. And also Tom DeLonge. Tom DeLonge has said that that the Antarctic projects weren't successful. So, what were the successful flying saucer models that were built? Well, here there's a Nazi SS document that was leaked after the end of the Cold War. So, with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, all of a sudden, a lot of intelligence files that belonged to the KGB, various Warsaw Pact countries were released. Vladimir Tyszynski was an engineer and was a member of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and he emigrated to the United States, and he eventually got his hands on some Nazi SS documents that had been held by the KGB and the Bulgarian Secret Service and so forth, and that specified the successful flying saucer models that had been developed by Germany that had been taken down to Antarctica. So here you have him referring to like the Hannibal 1, the name of one of these prototypes. He's, that there were two of them that had been built, 52 tests involving these craft, and this referred to the propulsion system, or where they had been constructed, and the propulsion system. So the E4 facility, that was the Nazi SS top secret facility, kind of like their Area 51, or actually more accurately S4 in Papoose Lake in Nevada. At the Area 51 facility, they have two places where they build very advanced aerospace craft. One is the spy craft, that's Groom Lake, and the other one is the S4 facility, and that's at Papoose Lake in Area 51. So, you know, some people have speculated that the S4 facility was modelled after the E4 facility that the Nazi SS had developed in Germany. And that's quite possible because later on the Germans really helped the US build their research facilities, their flying saucer studies. So here it goes through, similarly, the Hannibal 2 gives you the number built, the number of test flights, the propulsion system, And the Vril 1, which was kind of like the first of the spacecraft or the anti-gravity craft built by the Germans. It tells us 17 were built, 84 tests, and it used a propulsion device called the Schumann levitator. So who was Schumann, and what was the Schumann levitator? Well, Winifred Schumann was a professor from the University of Munich, and he was one of the German scientists taken to Wright-Patterson airfield immediately after the Second World War, because his expertise was in high-energy plasma and torsion field physics, and he is on the list of scientists that were asked or that were taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, immediately after the Second World War to help the Air Force start developing its own flying saucer program. So Schumann built the first Schumann levitators for the Vril Society in 1922. So this stuff goes back to the early 1920s, that the Germans were working on these kind of flying saucer programs. And what's important here is to keep in mind that 1922, that was during the Weimar Republic. And Germany at that time was the very, very different to Nazi Germany. The Weimar Republic was probably the most open and most progressive nation on the planet in terms of its openness to new ideas and initiatives. And so this is where there were a lot of efforts to build a civilian space program. That's the very first civilian space program emerged in Weimar Republic during the 1920s, and that was led by a number of German secret societies that believed that this was possible. So the Schumann levitator was based on the idea of electrogravitics. 1928, the first patent by Thomas Townsend Brown basically proposed how electrogravitics represented a new force that kind of defied Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is based on the idea of for every force there's an equal and opposite reaction, a third law of motion, and so if you want to propel something forward, you have to have an equal force. If you want something to go forward, you need to propel something in the opposite direction. So that way you maintain Newton's laws of motion. And so this was something that defied that, because there was nothing being expelled behind the craft. That Thomas Townsend Brown realised that once you have a very high electrostatic charge or differential between the positive side and the negative side, there was a thrust. So this was a force that was not something that appeared to obey Newton's laws of motion. And so this was electrogravitics, and this was something Thomas Townsend Brown proposed, but the Germans took up this idea very, very seriously. So the Vril Society used the Schumann levitators to build their very first prototypes in the 1920s. And by the end of the 1930s, when the Nazis came into power, they came into power in 1933, they took it all over. So the civilian space program that these German secret societies were sponsoring and supporting was now all kind of like incorporated or taken over by the Nazi SS. And so there was a kind of a power struggle, if you like, between the Nazis and the German secret societies in terms of who had ultimate control over these advanced technologies. And that was something that continued right up till the very end, and in Antarctica, because the people in charge of Antarctica, the German operations in Antarctica, weren't the Nazis. It was the German Navy and German secret societies, because these were the groups that began the programs in the 1920s, and that they were ardent German nationalists, but they weren't Nazi ideologues, and there's a big difference. The Nazis were racists. The German secret societies were nationalists. So they they just wanted to basically ensure that Germany would become a great power and work alongside other great nations in some sort of fraternity. Because, and you can actually see it today. I mean, American nationalists, Hungarian nationalists, Russian nationalists, they get on quite well. They speak the same language. So nationalists do actually get on quite well because they have strict kind of boundaries in terms of how they define themselves, but they are capable of cooperating. So the German nationalists were capable of cooperating with nationalists from other nations. But Hitler, because he was an ideologue, a racist, he launched Germany into the Second World War, and there was a struggle. Not all this is one of the things that's not well known, is that in 1938, just before Neville Chamberlain went to Munich, of the background, were in charge of these Vril craft, and so some of them could reach 12,000 kilometres an hour and had various characteristics in terms of being able to stay in the air, and that these were constructed and tested between 42 and 44 and had 84 test flights, as I earlier mentioned. And that group developed this Thule tachynator device, and that used ideas like based on free energy, various rotating electrogravitics, torsion field physics, and so it was a very different propulsion system, but nevertheless it was something that was incorporated into some of these successful prototypes that the Nazis were developing. They actually developed in 1933 a free energy device. So this was something that they began incorporating into some of their advanced aerospace programs and into their submarines, some of the submarines. So this is how it looked, and that, according to Tazinski, the sources of information he got, the Siemens Corporation was building the propulsion system for these Hannibal craft that used this Thule tachynator drive. So we actually have a name of a major German company, Siemens, that was building these propulsion craft for these propulsion systems for the flying saucer craft. So the Siemens Corporation was doing that, and Germany pretty much pioneered the process by which major companies would be given these military contracts to build the kind of advanced aerospace vehicles or the munitions that would be used for the war effort. That the Germans kind of helped pioneer that effort, and that this was something that the United States followed, and Britain, they did the same with their companies later. So this is the Hannibal 1 craft. This is one of the SS documents that was released. Here the instructions, the kind of capability of that, and I just kind of want to mention, this was first created as a tank killer, so this was to be used during the war against tanks. It it had a flight time of 18 hours, which, if this was successfully deployed, it would have been much more effective than jet planes or the other aircraft that the Germans had that they were using against the Allied armies. It had cannons and so forth, crew of 8, and it could fly up to 17,000 kilometres an hour, between 4,800 to 17,000. So quite fast, but not capable of breaking Earth's orbit. So, that's another picture of the Hannibal 1. And it shows the cannon there. These were things that the Nazis were developing. These are actual photos that come from that era. And these were the craft that they took down to Antarctica. So that's why I'm spending a little bit of time so we get an idea of what the Germans had down there. So here's a video of the Hanabu 1 craft that, let's see if it plays. Okay, there we go. So this is allegedly a photo of a genuine Hanabu test from 1939. It shows that these things were being tested, and the plan was to use them in the war, outfit them with cannons so that they could actually become tank killers. That was the idea, and some of them would also be used against the bombers and so forth. But the Germans just ran out of time. And the people's, one of the questions that people often ask is, well, if the Germans were developing all this stuff, how come they failed? Why didn't they win the war if they had all these technology and were testing them? Well, Hitler basically badly miscalculated. He really thought that they could just win using the overwhelming military forces, but things that could be used against kind of like Allied bombers, they didn't put the resources into that. And that's exemplified in the development of the Messerschmitt jet, the 262 Messerschmitt, because it's quite, and this is something that is widely acknowledged, if the Germans had put resources into developing the Messerschmitt jet as a fighter, they would have won the war. They would have shot down all of the Allied bombers. They wouldn't have had a chance against jet craft, because the Allied used propeller-driven bombers and fighters, and the Germans had pioneered these Messerschmitt jets that could just fly under Mach 1. They would have just decimated the bombers and their fighter escorts. But the Nazis had miscalculated. They couldn't build enough of them at the end of the war. And it was the same thing with these flying saucers. They just ran out of time in Europe, in occupied Europe. But the ones they took into Antarctica, they had more time to develop them. So here you have the Hanabu 2, kind of a slightly larger model. Here are the characteristics of that. I don't want to spend much time on that, but these are documents you can find online. Here's something I just wanted to point out. This is a critical piece of information because it tells us the name of the German company that was building the Hanabu craft, the Hanabu 2. That was Dornier Jets, or Dornier Aircraft Company. So, with these Nazi SS documents, we actually get an idea of the characteristics and the capability of these flying saucers and the companies that built them, which is very important because in the lead up to the Second World War, German companies worked very closely with American companies. They were partners in many, many projects. And during the Second World War, many American companies continued to work with German companies. For example, IT&T, a major aerospace company today, worked with Nazi Germany throughout the Second World War. Now, why did the Americans do this, or how could this have been done? I think there were multiple reasons for it. It gave the Americans a means of being able to infiltrate Nazi Germany, because if American companies continued to work in Nazi Germany, American spies could go in there and find out what was going on. And these American companies were given exemptions by President Roosevelt. Many people know about the Trading with the Enemy Act. That was a World War I document that was passed, preventing companies trading with the enemy. But President Roosevelt, just as the Second World War began, issued an executive order where American companies could be exempted from the Trading with the Enemy Act and continue to operate with the Germans. So this was a way for the American companies to learn about what the Germans were up to. So here you have again a Hanabu 2 craft. Shows you the size of this thing, very large compared to, here's a little hut. Here it is compared to a large truck. And then you have the Hanabu 3 craft. And this is important because this was one of the successful craft that the Germans had developed. that could be taken down to Antarctica, flown down to Antarctica. Had a flight range of flight time 7 to 8 weeks. Had armaments, cannon and so forth. Armour, triple Victolan. Studies have been done on this. German metallurgists were actually coming up with very unique alloys, metal alloys for the various armaments that they were building and craft that they were building down there. So, research has been done. Even though I haven't found any internet reference to Victolan, other than these Nazi SS documents, it's possible that this was one of the alloys, one of the classified alloys that the Germans had built that remained classified up until the Second World War. It shows you the crew of 32 with up to 70 people. And so as the Second World War was coming to a close, they were flying these things to Antarctica, just filling them up with people and whatever they needed. Now, the important thing about this one is the speed. It could fly up to 40,000 kilometres an hour. And that's important because that's the escape velocity for Earth. So if you could fly at 40,000 kilometres an hour, you could fly beyond the Earth's orbit, go to the moon and beyond. The Nazis weren't just developing flying saucer craft, they were also developing cigar-shaped craft. So here you have something called the Andromeda device. And this was built by the Zeppelin company. And the Zeppelin company had partnered with the Goodyear company to build the world's first flying aircraft carriers in 1931. How many people knew that in 1931 the United States had flying aircraft carriers? Just raise your hands. Okay. One of the things that they don't talk about too much, but the US did have 2 flying aircraft carriers. These were rigid dirigibles, so they were filled with helium gas and kind of conventional propulsion systems, and aircraft could fly up to these to the USS Akron and Macron, and there was a special grappling system that they could hoist them into the craft or release them. So yeah, the US in the Navy in the 30s had flying aircraft carriers, and that the companies involved in building these, Zeppelin and Goodyear, well, Zeppelin in particular built an advanced model called the Andromeda device that was outfitted with these advanced kind of propulsion systems that I was talking about, the Thule tachyonator, the Schumann levitator. Those kinds of exotic propulsion systems were part of this device that was able to travel outside of Earth's orbit and also fly interstellar missions because they were able to develop space-time technology. And this is one of the things that people kind of like have a lot of trouble wrapping their minds around. Well, how could the Nazis had developed things capable of space-time travel, that they could travel to another solar system? That this is where it gets into these kinds of technologies where if you have torsion field physics, that space-time is impacted. So if you get something spinning, if you spin plasma around quickly enough, that you can bend space-time. Okay, so now we get to one of the kind of like stumbling blocks for many people, because I think maybe what I've talked about is feasible, because if you have scientists that are bright enough and a kind of a culture, a society that has the political intent and the wherewithal to do this, you could probably do some of these things that I've been talking about. Well, the next thing comes from William Tompkins, and this is one of the things that he says that the US Navy was learning about from these debriefings of the Navy spies. And he says that essentially the Germans were being helped by a reptilian extraterrestrial race, that this advanced culture, this off-world culture, reptilians, were giving the Germans the kind of information that they needed, not only for building successful flying saucer prototypes but also for going down to Antarctica and finding the ancient cavern systems so that they could build their bases down there. Apparently, according to Tompkins, this is what the reptilians were telling the Germans. And Bill Tompkins, he passed away in August of last year. Very unfortunate. He was 94, so could have just been natural causes. So he passed away, but he said that when the Navy spies were coming in to Naval Air Station San Diego, telling everyone what was going on, he said that that the Navy captains and the Admiral at first didn't believe it. They didn't believe a lot of this stuff. They thought it was disinformation. The Germans were very good at disinformation. But there were 29 spies, and they were coming back with kind of variations on the same theme. You know, the Germans were building flying saucers, multiple prototypes, and that they were being helped by different groups of extraterrestrials, and one of them was a reptilian race, and that they had actually reached an agreement with Hitler. So that by the end of the day, the Navy spies were providing a lot of information that the Admiral running the program believed was very plausible, quite credible. And his name was Admiral Rico Borda. And by the way, he wasn't an Australian. I think one of the very few Australians that have become admirals in the US Navy, actually born in Melbourne in 1891 and joined the US Navy, I think it was 1919, and by the 1930s by the early 1940s had become an admiral in the US Navy. So he was part of the debriefings of these Navy spies who were saying that this was going on in Germany. So what was happening? The Germans apparently set up a space command in Antarctica, and so this, according to Vladimir Terzinsky, is their command and control operations in Antarctica. And that they were running operations into outer space. That the first man on the moon was not Neil Armstrong, was, according to Terzinsky, it was this man, Werner Heisenberg, who led the first successful moon landing in 1943. I mean, there's a rewriting of history that's going to be happening here if any of this turns out to be real, because this is, a fundamental thing to consider, that if Germany did successfully build a space program in Antarctica that was able to send these craft into outer space and go to the moon and to Mars, then our history is going to have to be rewritten. So, according to these files, the Germans led their first expedition to Mars in 1945. And this is something Corey Gordon, Bill Tompkins have also said that they came across that information. So this was, Terzinsky was the first one to start talking about that in 1991. He was giving lectures in the United States. So yeah, that's kind of quite a big leap, but this is what we're being told has been happening. So if you have a space program in Antarctica, how do you fund that? Do you do a lottery? I mean, you set up casinos, do lotteries, fund the German space program in Antarctica. Well, it's one way, but it'd take you a lot of lotteries to get the money to build a space program, and without having the major powers run down there to find out what you're up to. So how do you do it? Well, you set up a secret funding system. And just prior to the Second World War, actually after the Battle of Stalingrad and after the Normandy invasion, it was quite clear that Nazi Germany was going to lose the war. And so the German industrialists began looking at ways to move lots of capital out of Nazi Germany. And in August of 1944, the Nazi SS, along with Martin Bormann, who was the Vice Führer, the Deputy Führer, okayed the movement of capital and resources out of Nazi Germany. Prior to August 1944, it was an offence. You know, you could be punished. You know, you could be accused of treason if you moved resources or funds out of Germany during the war. But now the green light had been given, and they told all the major industrialists, move as much capital, as much resources as you can to neutral countries, to friendly countries, friendly corporations. You know, basically use whatever networks you have to move all of these resources out of Germany, because the effort to establish a 1,000-year Reich through military means was a failure. We will now do it through covert economic means. And this is a document that, that basically supports exactly that the Germans, prior to the defeat, actually set in place a massive movement of capital. It was called Operation Eagle Flight, to move massive amounts of capital prior to the defeat, so that after the war they could use that capital not only to rebuild Germany, but also to create a Fourth Reich, which would be established through covert economic means. And so that was how they could fund the German program in Antarctica. Now, who was down there? Who was down there in Antarctica? Who was building the flying saucers and the munitions and the special metal alloys for the craft down in Antarctica? These are amongst the German companies that were involved in building various components for the successful flying saucers that went down to Antarctica. I mentioned Dornier earlier, that built the Hannibal II. These other companies, Messerschmitt, they were also involved in building various components for the successful flying saucers that had been taken down to Antarctica. The Siemens Corporation, AEG, they were building the propulsion systems. Zeppelin was building the very large cigar-shaped craft down there. IG Farben was building the weapons system, the laser cannons that the Germans were working on. The first laser technology was developed in Nazi Germany in the 1940s by IG Farben. Röchling was also involved. Krupp, these were building the special alloys. These were kind of steel companies, major steel companies, building the various alloys, the Victorlin, for the craft. So, you know, you can't just build flying saucers in Antarctica in these massive caverns that the Nazi SS or the German secret societies had built down there. You needed to have the industrial know-how. You needed to have people who knew how to build things. And these were the companies that knew how to build the successful flying saucer craft. And all of these companies, prior to the Second World War, collaborated to various extents with US companies. So the foundation was laid so that after the Second World War, after an agreement had been reached, that German companies that were building these things in Antarctica, using whatever resources they could get from Operation Eagle Flight, it could eventually be complemented or increased dramatically with American technologies and companies coming in. And that's exactly what happened. We have Jim Mars wrote a book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, that showed how the Germans set up this massive kind of economic program to build a Fourth Reich using economic means. So that's something that he discussed at length in the book. So now we get to what was the end of the war comes about. Germany is defeated in Europe, but you have this German colony in Antarctica. So what do? If you're the American Navy and you know that the Germans have established a colony in Antarctica, what's your first step? Well, first step is doing some reconnaissance and maybe see if you can strike a deal. struck a deal with the Germans in Antarctica because deals had been struck with the Germans, Nazi Germany. At the end of the Second World War, there was a common desire to defend against communism. Soviet communism was seen as a great threat now with the end of the Second World War. And Nazi SS and many German commanders did negotiate with the CIA, with the American military, wherever possible. And so negotiations happened and deals were struck. And so you had Operation Paperclip, and a lot of resources were moved to the United States. So the American Navy, the US National Security apparatus thought that the same thing could happen in Antarctica. And so they sent their special negotiator down there. And this was Admiral Byrd. Admiral Richard Byrd, who was well known to the Germans in Antarctica because Admiral Byrd actually was invited to Berlin in 1938 to kick off the German Antarctic expedition from 1938-39. The Germans had great respect for Admiral Byrd because he was a polar explorer, had been to the Arctic regions and to Antarctica, so they had great respect for him. And so Byrd went down there as the emissary for the US military to see if a deal could be struck with the Germans in Antarctica. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Ware, one of my colleagues in the US, he was close friends with Commander Graham Bethune, and this was one of the things that Colonel Ware said about Admiral Byrd being taken down to Antarctica to negotiate. He said he got this from Admiral Byrd. He was told by he got this from Graham Bethune. Graham Bethune, the commander, told Colonel Ware that he was the pilot who flew Admiral Byrd to Antarctica in 1945, that Byrd was sent down there to find out what was going on. He was sent home early. Negotiations had failed. But I think Byrd was able to negotiate US scientists joining the German scientists in their underground base working on advanced technology. So the Germans wanted to begin the process of collaborating with the United States and opened the door to American scientists coming in, but still I think that the Germans down there calculated that they wanted to negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. And so they needed a little bit more time to perfect their flying saucer technologies to welcome the Americans when they came up, when they showed up in force. And that's what happened the next year. Operation Highjump, the flagship was the USS Philippine Sea. It had a number of aircraft there. And it's kind of funny the way in which history describes Operation Highjump. It was a scientific mission with 3,800 Navy personnel, Marines, jet fighters, tanks even, that was sent on a science mission without scientists. It's kind of like funny how that works out. It's like, what was their real mission down there? Well, I think we know that there was more to Operation Highjump, which was really the first available Antarctic summer that the Navy could assemble an armada to go down there to seek out and destroy the German bases if necessary, to put pressure on the Germans. Well, unfortunately, the Germans now had perfected their technologies, their weapon systems, so that they were ready. So the Germans, and the thing to keep in mind is that from 1939, early 1939, when the Germans first began building their bases in Antarctica, right up until 1947, early 47, so we're talking about a period of 8 years, they were able to operate in Antarctica without any need to deal with an attacking force. And so, unlike what was happening in Germany, occupied Germany, the Antarctic colonies were able to have the sufficient time, uninterrupted by massive Allied bombing raids, to basically finalise their weapons technology for the flying saucers. So this is what happened. They were successful in basically destroying enough of the armaments that Byrd deployed, aircraft and ships, destroyers and so forth, to get Byrd to basically turn around. And the way Corey Goode described this, he said that the Germans wanted to give the Americans a bloody nose, but they didn't want to destroy them because they wanted to establish a basis for future negotiations and a deal to be struck. So they didn't want to destroy the American fleet, they just wanted to give it a bloody nose, just destroy enough so that the Americans would turn back and realise that they were dealing with a very advanced power now in Antarctica. And the Germans had been helped in Antarctica. I've already mentioned the reptilians, but they also were being given help by another major power in Antarctica, and these were the Ariani. I mentioned earlier the German U-boat captains being given instructions for sailing or going under the Antarctic ice sheet to find their way to Agartha. Well, what was Agartha? Agartha was a colony in Antarctica where you had these kind of inner earth beings, humans, who were very advanced, whose history goes back many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, and that they were helping the Germans in Antarctica. And Admiral Byrd actually had an encounter with the Ariani. And there is an actual, this is verified, that Admiral Byrd did lead a mission into the interior of Antarctica during Operation Highjump, where his craft was lost for several hours. They thought he had crashed. He was delayed by several hours, and then eventually he showed up. Well, Admiral Byrd wrote a diary, a posthumous diary, which is still very controversial. Some people say it's a hoax, some people say it's genuine. According to my sources, it's genuine. And Admiral Byrd describes actually an encounter with the Ariani in Antarctica during Operation Highjump. So he went down there and apparently he met a master, or someone that had a very advanced consciousness. And this was someone that was kind of like wanting Byrd to relay a warning to the United States hierarchy as far as building nuclear weapons was concerned. Can people up the back read that, or do you need me to? Yeah, if you just read that, please. So Agartha is kind of like a network of these underground civilizations or bases built around the world and also in Antarctica. Interesting that he refers to the Silver Fleet. Now, just kind of keep that in mind because later on I'll be talking about the Silver Fleet being spotted in Antarctica by a very credible Navy source. Okay, so Byrd meets these people and is given a message, and he takes the message to Washington, D.C. about the dangers of nuclear weapons, and that the inner Earth people, the Ariani, are very upset about that. And that the Ariani were helping the Germans. So now we get to this. People often want to know, well, there's Agartha and there's Shambhala. You know, are they the same thing? Are they synonyms, or are they talking about different things? Well, this information comes from Corey Goode. He says that the German secret societies believed that the Agarthans were ancient Aryans, the Ariani. And these were the ones that were helping the Thule Society, the German secret societies, learn about advanced technologies. And that they were the benevolent helpers of the German colonists in Antarctica, and also had had guided them, you know, in their expeditions to Tibet. And the Germans did launch expeditions to Tibet. The Shambhala inner Earth beings, they were kind of like competitors. They came from another area of the planet, Mongolia, And they were deemed by the Germans to be influenced by Zionists and Freemasons and were considered to be the historic enemy. So it kind of shows that conflict is something that has been around for a long, long time. It's not new to our current civilization. This goes back to the ancient peoples on the earth. Now, according to Corey, there are 7 inner earth civilizations, and he says he's met with these beings, he's encountered them, and given descriptions of them, and this is kind of like just a representation of some of these 7 inner earth civilizations that have come together. They have different ideologies. Some have had conflicts in the past. Some of them would be associated with Agartha. Some of them would be associated with Shambhala. But these are inner earth beings, and he's described them on the basis of, or differentiated them on the basis of these amulets. Some of them have Saturn symbols with, say, a black kind of jewel in there. Others have hourglass symbols. And racially, they're very different as well. Others have the swastika inner earth symbol. So the swastika, as I'm sure many of you know, predates Nazi Germany's use of the swastika. It goes back many thousands of years to ancient cultures, and some of these inner earth groups wear the swastika. They're not necessarily Nazis at all. That's just a symbol for the vril force, a dynamic force that emanates through the earth and through the chakra system of the body. The Omega group, this group, according to Corey Good, is masculine dominated. It's a patriarchy. Unlike the other groups, the earlier groups, as you can see, they have men and women. This group, the Omega group, is Byrd's Ariani. So, immediately after Byrd had his encounter with the Ariani, he goes down to Chile and he gives an interview. And he talks about a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole, and that they were capable of invading the United States with hostile aircraft. And he said that in the event of a new war, that America's going to have to deal with aircraft flying in from one or both poles. So, obviously, the North Pole would have been a route for the Soviet Union, but as far as I know, the Penguin aircraft fleet still hasn't been developed yet. The Penguins haven't reached that level of technological advancement. So, there's someone else down there capable of launching aircraft fleets against the United States. And so that takes us to the dawn of the UFO era in the United States, when all of a sudden many craft began to be sighted in the United States. And so maybe this is a good place for me to pause for the break. I think we're going to have a half-hour break now. And then we'll come back and I will just continue with the second half of the lecture. In June of 1947, which is when it's generally accepted as the UFO era having started in the United States, with the Kenneth Arnold incident in Oregon and Washington State. And just recall what I said earlier about Admiral Byrd warning about a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole, or from the poles over the United States territory. This only happened a few months before the Kenneth Arnold sighting incident. And here you have the craft that Kenneth Arnold saw, that he actually drew this craft, and even though he said it kind of skipped over the water like a saucer, he didn't say it looked like a saucer. This is how he described it. And the thing is, when you look at the shape of that, and he said there were fleets of these things in June flying over the US, you look at the comparison with the Horten fixed wing craft prototype that was under development in Nazi Germany, but that this was one of the unsuccessful models. So is this a version of the successful model of this? This didn't make it out of Nazi Germany down to Antarctica, but a prototype or something similar to this did, and so we can see the kind of similarity between them. Now, we think about, well, you know, what would have been the political implications of the Germans establishing a colony in Antarctica that was functional, that had these advanced flying saucer prototypes that could shoot down US craft, that could destroy US naval ships, that could overfly US territory with impunity. What would be the implications of that? Well, this was really a means of negotiating deals with the American government. And Corey Good kind of summarises this quite well. So if you just read that. So the Germans in Antarctica and the United States under President Truman at the time both had something that the other side desperately wanted. The Americans needed the kind of technological know-how of the Germans in terms of, well, how do these flying saucer craft operate? That they wanted to kind of catch up as quickly as possible, and the Nazis were desperately short of resources, personnel, and so there was negotiations happening. Now these apparently took a few years, so there was a kind of uneasy peace going on after Operation Highjump. Then in 1952 you have the UFO overflights of Washington DC, and originally when I heard about this I assumed, like many people, that these were extraterrestrial craft, but when I came across the secret space program information, I began to look at another possibility, and you know, Corey Good, William Tompkins, Clark McClelland, Tuzinski, all of these people all say the same thing, that the 52 overflights were actually German UFOs out of Antarctica. So just kind of imagine that. You know, imagine you're in a, you know, you're part of a cabinet under President Truman, or President Truman at the time. You're part of his cabinet, and you're told this. The Germans just overflew Washington DC, and we couldn't do a damn thing about it. What are you going to do? You can't shoot them down. They definitely have the technological advantage over you, and you desperately need their technology. Well, I think most people in that room would probably eventually say, well, at least they're not Nazis. They're nationalists, but that's okay. You know, we deal with nationalists all the time. So agreements were reached, and I think that's what happened. Agreements were reached with the Germans, and so secretly, while the United States continued to operate without kind of like any overt sign that there had been this secret agreement reached with the German space program out of Antarctica, over the years ahead, the signs began to emerge, but it was all very covert. And so this is where we get the idea that the Truman-Eisenhower administration really had agreed to kind of surrender terms with the German Antarctic program, and that the Fourth Reich actually began in this kind of collaboration with the United States. Now, one of the byproducts of this agreement was that the German craft were being sighted, and it appears that the agreement involved the occupants saying that the occupants wouldn't say that they were German, they would say that they were from another planet, that they would pretend to be extraterrestrials. And we kind of see the similarities between the craft, the scout craft that George Adamski says that he witnessed and eventually boarded in 1952, 53. He boarded these things. And you look at the similarities between that craft that he photographed in 52. These photos have never been debunked. You look at that similarity, the portholes, the stabilizers, the kind of large hemisphere underneath the craft, and compare it to the Hannibal 2. And I think the conclusion is pretty obvious that this is whoever built these things. Either they were the same or they collaborated quite closely. The only major difference, of course, is that the Hannibal were weaponized. These weren't. So maybe it was a result of two programs in Antarctica. One program which was weaponized, another wasn't, or possibly they learned to be able to use or kind of like internalize the weapon system, place it inside of the craft. But still, the similarities are so close that I think we can say that it's very reasonable to conclude that at least some of the UFO contact experiences that people have reported and sightings didn't involve extraterrestrial craft, but actually involved these German craft operating out of Antarctica. There's another incident which is kind of like really, there are other kind of contact experiences that suggest the kind of German connection. But I think that this one, the next one here, is very compelling. It was in 1956. It involved a US Army sergeant who had a career of 17 years, and he was working for Army intelligence, and he sighted, along with multiple witnesses, a craft landing on the island of Oahu, near Honolulu. And the craft landed, it had German insignia, that's the Iron Cross, and they were wearing German uniforms, Nazi uniforms. So now, Hawaii, or Oahu, is really just one big military garrison. You've got the Army, Navy, Air Force, they're all there. The Marines, they're all there. So the idea that a Nazi UFO could just land, or a Nazi craft could just land near Honolulu without there being any kind of military intervention suggests that there had to have been an agreement in place for this to happen. That the US Army or the US military was under orders not to engage with these German craft and just to monitor. Just monitor what they're doing, where they're landing, who they're meeting, and that was it. So that, I think, was what was going on. And that's very suggestive that agreements had been reached where, while on an official level you had the German space program out of Antarctica collaborating with the US military or the US national security complex, at the same time you had landings where private citizens were engaging with these German craft. So, within the Antarctic program, the German program, what I believe is the case, and I'll kind of get to that in the conclusion, is that there was a peaceful program that was led by the Vril Society, Maria Orsic and her people, that was into cosmic philosophy, brotherhood and peace and so forth. And then there was the other faction, which was kind of German nationalists that believed in military strength as a necessary ingredient for achieving your great power aspirations. So there were two German programs operating side by side out of Antarctica, and I think one was doing these private contacts in the 50s and the 60s. So the Fourth Reich infiltrates the US military-industrial complex. It's very well known that Operation Paperclip brought in thousands of German scientists in the 50s, after the end of the Second World War, and that many of these were fast-tracked into very senior positions. So just take a moment to read that. So why in the world would why would the national security apparatus grant German scientists from Germany security clearances that was fast-tracked and that American scientists were having great trouble getting, or they had to go through a lengthy process, sometimes taking a year or more? Why would that be? They were being fast-tracked because there was an agreement that had been reached, and that the German scientists were coming in, and there was a process of infiltration happening, and I think both sides were trying to outsmart one another. The American national security apparatus, they thought they could outsmart the Germans. After all, they'd won the war, the Second World War. They thought they could outsmart them, and the Germans that were infiltrating on behalf of the program out of Antarctica believed that they could outsmart the Americans. And so I think there was this kind of collaboration, but also an attempt to kind of outmaneuver the other that was happening throughout this period. But nevertheless, you know, the fact that 60 companies had these German scientists come in there and reach senior positions is very important, given what I mentioned earlier about German companies in Antarctica that had established a presence, building their successful prototypes, that they began to collaborate with American companies who now brought in, you know, more resources, more manpower. So now you actually have the space program out of Antarctica. Now, you know, what you call it, what do we call it? Corey Good calls it the Dark Fleet, and that's probably as good a term as any, because dark in the sense that we don't know much about it. There's so little known about it, because secrecy has been maintained, and you know, part of that process has been using slave labour, where people are eliminated at the end of that. So Corey Good says that he was taken to Antarctica twice, and that during the first occasion, I believe it was kind of like towards the middle of 2016, I think April or something of 2016, he says he was taken aboard this craft. This belongs to an inner Earth group, and he says he was taken on a reconnaissance mission of Antarctica. So this is one of the few first-hand testimonies that we have about what's under the ice. And he says that what he saw under the ice was this massive cavern that had an incredibly large industrial kind of venture going on. And what's especially significant, because this was said, you know, he came out with this information in April of 2016. He said that there were these large thermal vents that was heating this cavern system, and that the thermal vents were responsible for hollowing out those caverns in the first place. Now, no one else before that had said anything about thermal vents in Antarctica hollowing out caverns under the ice. No one had ever said anything about that. Corey Good was the first to say something. So these are the sort of things that, you know, researchers like myself, you know, pay a lot of attention to in terms of, well, you know, is he the real deal or not? And because he kind of consistently comes out with information that then a few months later or a year later is picked up by the major media in some kind of major announcement, that makes me lean more towards him being a very credible witness, and I still think he is a very credible witness. So anyway, so he's saying thermal vents in Antarctica in April 2016 that he saw that were heating these things up and that had originally built the caverns. So I mentioned it just before, 60 American companies are known to have been infiltrated by these German paperclip scientists, that many of these paperclip scientists went into these companies and others, and that they often got very senior leadership positions. And certainly it wasn't just companies, it was also the American space program. Kurt DeBus became the director of the Kennedy Space Center, which was set up to oversee the Apollo program. Werner von Braun was in charge of the Marshall Flight Space Center, which was based on the old Army program using German scientists to develop powerful rockets for the military and for the space program. So he was in charge of the Marshall Space Center, and there are other prominent Nazis in kind of senior positions throughout the military-industrial complex. So this happened because of a secret deal that's what I believe made this possible. But certainly, we can now start talking about German companies, American companies working in tandem to build these kinds of things. Massive fleets of spacecraft that could go out into deep space, that could be part of a kind of dark fleet that could go out there and conquer other worlds or operate in establishing colonies on other planets in our solar system. So after the agreement was reached, I think it was around President Eisenhower coming into power, 1954-55, Eisenhower had meetings with these Germans and the extraterrestrial allies, and agreements were reached. So then, 56-57, Antarctica is opened up in terms of the major powers are now allowed to establish permanent bases on the surface of Antarctica. So this is when all the major countries started to build their permanent bases. So the Americans built 3, the Russians also started to build theirs, and Australia, I think, followed not long afterwards. So the agreements paved the way for Antarctica to have these permanently manned bases set up on the surface that could begin scientific exploration. Now, one of the things that clearly needed to be dealt with was how can you reconcile having bases, permanent bases on the surface of Antarctica where the major nations that might not have been part of the American-German agreement have bases, with this kind of effort to build a vast kind of armed space program under the Antarctic ice sheets. How do you reconcile that? Well, the plan, or what happened was that they came up with this. It's called the Antarctic Treaty. It was signed in 1959 and ratified by 1961. 12 signatory nations signed it in 59, including Australia, and currently it has, I think, around 55 nations that are part of it. The Antarctic Treaty basically demilitarizes Antarctica and maintains that there can be no weapons development there, that no military forces deployed there, and that all research has to be done for peaceful scientific purposes. So obviously, there's a contradiction here, right? I mean, if the Germans and the Americans are doing all this stuff under the ice sheet, but the Antarctic Treaty is in place on the surface, what's the real intent here? Well, I think the real intent was that the Germans didn't want any other nations establishing bases on the surface that could become a military threat to them. So they basically made sure that the Antarctic Treaty was signed. And it's very strictly monitored. Basically, any nation can do a spot inspection of the Antarctic facilities of any other nation to ensure that they're abiding by the terms of the Antarctic Treaty, which is actually a very handy way for the Germans under the ice sheet to make sure that no one up there can ever be a threat to them. So now, okay, we get to what else is going on in Antarctica. A Navy engineer by the name of Brian, he had a number of experiences in Antarctica, and he came forward and released some of his documentation. And he served in Antarctica for 14 years. He served for 20 years before retiring from the US Navy. And there were a few incidents that he described seeing that kind of stand out in terms of us better understanding what's happening today in Antarctica. One of the first things was that he says he saw silver discs that during some of the overflights of the Navy craft that would provide all the kind of logistical support for the permanent manned bases up there in Antarctica, that he said on several occasions they saw fleets of silver discs flying over the trans-Antarctic mountains. Kind of very remote area, no bases, no permanent bases in the trans-Antarctic mountains. So who did the Silver Fleet belong to? I mentioned them earlier on. Who had the Silver Fleet? I mentioned them earlier. Anyone want to guess? The inner Earth beings. They had the Silver Fleets. These were the ones that were helping the Germans down there in Antarctica. So they had silver fleets. So this was, and he's a very credible witness. Certainly, I mean, he's got a very persuasive story about what he saw, what he experienced as a consequence of what he witnessed. Also, he said that he overflew the South Pole, and very close to the South Pole there was a massive hole. And in this massive hole, it wasn't a vertical drop to the straight down. It was kind of at an incline, and it was a massive hole big enough to have like a C-130 cargo plane go into it. And according to Corey Good, he says that these are things that are being caused by the thermal vents under the Antarctic ice sheet, that they're being naturally formed. So, but this is what this Navy flight engineer saw just near the South Pole, a massive hole coming up there. He also says he heard a lot of rumours about extraterrestrials working with the Americans out of the Scott Amundsen base, which is right next to the South Pole. And finally, he talked about this incident involving missing scientists who were to do a mission, I think it was to last about 3 weeks. But after 2 weeks, radio communication ceased. So he had to fly an exploratory mission there, or his crew was sent on an exploratory mission. And they couldn't find the scientists. And then a week later, the scientists radio in and said, come pick us up. And that these scientists were just petrified, that they had seen things that had they wouldn't talk at all about it. Every effort to engage them in conversation, they were in silence, in shock. They basically brought to the United States and debriefed, and then they were sent back to New Zealand. So I'm trying to track down some of these people. If anyone actually knows about any of these missing scientists, that would actually be very helpful. But that was an example again of things happening in Antarctica that involve a lot of very classified research, and some of it is quite dangerous or scary. Lake Vostok, radar mapping in 1990, and when Lake Vostok was confirmed to exist in 1990, it was about 250 miles. What's that? About 400 kilometres. Length, so a massive lake under the Antarctic ice. Scientists were really very excited about that, saying, wow, we could send robotic probes down through the 3 kilometres of ice. We can send the probes down there to explore what's there, and we will. This will be a great way for us to develop our robotic technologies that we'll be needing for future Europa missions. So they were wanting to use Lake Vostok as a test for developing robotic probes that would be later sent by NASA to Europa to drill under the ice sheets on Europa. So that was the talk at the time. Then something happened very soon after Lake Vostok was discovered. And they found a large magnetic anomaly, about 50 miles in diameter, 80 kilometres, and very close to the magnetic South Pole, or Vostok base. And so this magnetic anomaly changed things dramatically. All of a sudden, NASA became environmentalists. It's like, oh no, we can't send robotic probes down through the ice. We'll pollute the pristine Antarctic atmosphere down there and the environment. It hasn't been exposed for millions of years. No, we don't want to send our robotic probes there. It'll take at least 10 years for us to send, to develop the sufficient technologies. And so, the official media is just kind of like, oh yeah, fair enough, that's what you say. Nothing's happening in Antarctica. But no, they sent covert teams down there. Covert teams went down to Antarctica, down to Lake Vostok. And Richard Hoagland was the first to kind of like really research this in depth, and he had access to some really credible whistleblowers, and he found that he began getting the information that this magnetic anomaly was in fact an ancient city, that they'd found a buried city down there, and had nothing to do with the kind of more prosaic explanations for this magnetic anomaly. It was just a lot of metal associated with a buried city under the ice. So, as I mentioned, there was covert drilling happening in Antarctica to get to Lake Vostok. So if you just read that, this was from 2001. Now, when they did send the scientists down there to Lake Vostok, the personnel down there, Hoagland discovered that a lot of them were getting very sick. The speculation was that, well, this is probably has something to do with the torsion field physics that this city had used, or that was associated with the city. Maybe it was a series of extraterrestrial craft down there, but certainly there was something that was not accounted for, and that the covert teams couldn't deal with it, whatever it was. And that one of the major corporations that was involved with it at the time, the Raytheon Corporation, that was their employees that were getting sick. So this was around 2001 that this information began to emerge. The next year you have rumours of an Antarctic city being found and being captured on video. Now the interesting thing about this particular story was that it came out in 2002, and kind of like pretty spectacular headlines, spectacular ruins in Antarctica captured on video. US denies that. Well, it turns out that this press release, it was actually promoting a book. And the book had to do with kind of ancient civilizations in Antarctica being discovered. But it was kind of more than coincidental that this kind of press release comes out and this book comes out around the same time that Hoagland and others are talking about an ancient city being discovered in Antarctica. And the best way to hide the truth is to, or the best way to keep a secret is to hide it in plain sight. So you put it out there through a source that you can easily discredit. So this was a source that was very easily discredited because it was really little more than just a promotion for a new book, and that there was no company called Atlantis TV with television crews operating out of Los Angeles that had been sent down to Antarctica. This was all a concoction, but it was to hide the truth that people were being sent down to Antarctica to film the ancient ruins. I think that's confirmation for that call. Just tell them that, yes, well, we want to know what you want to tell us. So Corey Good comes along and he says that, well, it was actually in 2002 that they opened up Antarctica to different nations wanting to learn about the ancient civilization down there. That there was a civilization that had been buried under the ice, in a that had been flash frozen. That in fact Charles Hapgood was correct. Remember I mentioned him earlier, the Earth's shifting poles. That Hapgood was correct, that there had been a pole shift, and that 14,000 years ago these ancient ruins were part of a flourishing civilization that had been established there by Martians. And that's what Corey Good says, that these guys were, that these were Martians. But then there had been everything had been flash frozen and perfectly preserved. These guys went into stasis chambers in their motherships, and they've been sleeping there ever since, which, as I mentioned, corroborates what we find in the Book of Enoch, where it talks about the fallen angels being imprisoned in this land of burning day and night, in this land of everlasting sunshine. Of course, only 6 months of the year. So Corey calls them a pre-Adamite civilization, so that's a reference to this civilization prior to the Great Flood that had been established by these Martian refugees. So now we get to more recent events. In 2011, Lockheed Martin, the world's largest defence contractor, gets the Antarctic Support Contract, which is awarded every 10 years by the National Science Foundation in the United States. So they got it for 10 years, and it's a cover for them because why would the world's largest defence contractor be interested in helping scientists monitor the reproduction behaviour of penguins, or the migratory habits of whales in the Antarctic environment? Not at all. This was a cover. I mean, in order for Lockheed Martin to send its teams down to Antarctica to be able to kind of like see what was buried under the ice and whether any of it could be weaponized, because that's what defence contractors do, right? They look at promising new technologies, and the first thing that comes into these PhDs running these programs is, well, can this be weaponized? Because that's why they're being paid by the contractors, because Lockheed Martin makes big profits out of new weapon systems that the Army, Navy, Air Force purchase. So Lockheed Martin gets this this contract in 2011, and then, according to some of the sources, Lockheed Martin employees start experiencing the same problem as the Raytheon employees earlier on. They start getting very sick. And so they need more expertise, and they couldn't do it on their own. Lockheed Martin traditionally works very, very closely with the US Air Force. So the Air Force best scientists couldn't come up with a solution to this. So they had to hand it over to the opposition, or get the opposition coming in. And so the opposition to the Air Force, is another military service, which is the Navy. And the Navy has been very closely involved with another company, a major multinational called SAIC, Strategic Applications International Corporation, which has been working very closely with the Navy from its inception. It had been created by a Navy officer in the 1960s. Admiral Bobby Ray Inman was on the board of directors for SAIC for many years. And then in 2013, SAIC reinvents itself. It kind of does one of these complex corporate split-offs where it renames itself Leidos, and it gets the Antarctic Support Foundation. And so now it goes down into Antarctica, and it's sending its special teams down to Antarctica. And this was a way for the Navy to kind of reassert influence in Antarctica, that whatever the Air Force guys were doing down there with Lockheed Martin, they couldn't work it out, so they needed the Navy to come in with their people to kind of jointly work out how to get access to the technologies under the Antarctic ice. Now, part of the reason why Antarctica is becoming such a hot issue is because it's literally melting. It's melting very quickly. So this is a very recent picture, a very recent diagram. It came out this year, June of 2017, and it showed the large surface melts in Antarctica. That the surface of Antarctica was starting to melt. And if you look at, where this is happening, right? Look at where this is happening, right? Around here. That's the Ross Ice Shelf over here. You can see the corner where there are large surface melts. Look at that, and now compare it to this earlier picture we saw of the volcanoes in Antarctica. The volcanoes are becoming more active. And as they become more active, as more of the ice melts from underneath, the volcanoes' activity increases. Because one of the things that was preventing the volcanoes in Antarctica from being too active was the large amount of ice that was over them, compacting the volcanoes. But now, as the ice sheet is melting from underneath, and you have large surface melts on the top because a lot of these steam vents are coming up, melting the ice cap, the Antarctica's, especially West Antarctica, that's the Ross Ice Shelf, is very quickly melting away. And this is where, again, with Corey Goode, I mean, he definitely is giving some very important intelligence in advance of what we hear from the major media. He was the first to kind of like confirm, as I kind of mentioned earlier, that there was a vast cavern network that was formed by volcanic activity that was capable of hosting life. That it was, it was only last year, kind of like, I can't remember the month, but July, August of last year, that scientific papers were published acknowledging that there was a vast network of caverns under the Antarctic ice that had been hollowed out by volcanic activity, and that it was warm enough down there, 25 degrees Celsius, to host life. So, Corey Goode had been saying this earlier, and it helps corroborate the stories of people like Vladimir Terzinsky writing in the early 1990s that, according to the Warsaw Pact intelligence files, the Germans had built a space program under the Antarctic ice in massive ice caverns. So now, in 2017, the scientific community is starting to put out papers acknowledging many of these aspects of Antarctica. So the ice, and so here's an article where I talk a little bit about the ice shelf being destabilised as a result of the thermal activity coming from underneath, and also from different major nations drilling down deep into Antarctica from the surface. And so as you have a lot of advanced technology being used to build holes from the surface down into the interior so that scientific teams can go down there and begin exploring the cavern system, looking for the buried technologies or the technologies that are now being found under the Antarctic ice sheet, that's destabilising the ice sheet more and more. So it's really got very little to do with global warming. So you can, your car's not responsible, so you can drive home with a clear conscience. That it's actually got to do much more with the Earth's internal mechanisms whereby seismic or volcanic activity is increasing. And that seems to be a phenomenon that's happening on other planets in our solar system, that all of the planets are displaying characteristics of global warming, but that's because the core is somehow being stimulated by increased cosmic energy as our solar system moves into a region of the galaxy where there's more of these things. Corey Good talked about a secret a battle over Antarctica, Antarctic skies, during January of 2016, where he says that a lot of these very large kilometre-long ships, these teardrop-shaped ships that had been built in these vast industrial facilities under the Antarctic ice sheet, were trying to leave with thousands of the global elite. So these people were fearing something, or maybe they were running away from a predicted geological event. Rumours of some of you, I'm sure, have heard of Major Ed Dames and the solar kill shot. The idea that the sun is going to release a massive solar flare, which will kind of wipe out a lot of the kind of infrastructure on the surface of the planet, and maybe do worse damage. So maybe they were leaving for that, or maybe they were leaving because of some political catastrophe that we are now witnessing. Then I'll be talking about at length pretty shortly. I should mention that according to Corey, these craft were not allowed to leave. They were intercepted by craft belonging to what he calls the Earth Alliance, but essentially it's the Russian space program. The Russians didn't allow these guys, the global elite, to escape. It's like, you've created big problems on our planet Earth, you're going to stay here and we're going to see through it all together. So here's Corey says that he was taken on a tour of the Antarctic facilities in April of 2016. Again, it's kind of like all of this, the western region seems to be the predominant place where you have these very large industrial facilities that have been building all of these kilometre-long spacecraft that are used by the Dark Fleet and by the corporate space program, the interplanetary corporate conglomerate, as he calls it. But the corporations have also developed their own program as a result. This is German corporations, US corporations that collaborated. They built their own program. And so here's this last base. This is pretty close to where the old German bases used to be. So this is probably the initial base that was built by the Germans. But as you can see, with American intervention, much larger bases were built. Okay, so now we have 2016 progresses, 2017 comes along. We have John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, and he went down to Antarctica for a pretty big, for an important job. I mean, he had to explain to the global elite down there, he had to explain to them how this person called Donald Trump could possibly win the presidential election. I mean, they were very disappointed because they always believed that America was the best democracy money could buy. And it's like, what happened? We paid for Hillary to win, and it didn't turn out the way they wanted. So Donald Trump wins the election. So they're very disappointed, and he had to go down there and give them the bad news. Democracy sometimes works. We can't control it completely. It's a wild card. And so this wild card, Donald Trump, becomes president. And there are other people that go down to Antarctica. The Patriarch of Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church, goes down to Antarctica. You see the penguins. Everyone wants to go down to Antarctica to see the penguins. Isn't that amazing? It's amazing. So he went down to Antarctica after signing a cooperation agreement with this guy, Pope Francis. So he meets and they sign a historic agreement, and then the Russian Patriarch goes down to Antarctica for whatever the purpose is. Now, the thing is, keep in mind that the Russians are very active now in Antarctica. I mean, if it's true what Corey said, that the Russian space program basically intercepted and prevented the German space program craft from leaving, it's like, well, Russia now is a big player in Antarctica. So Patriarch Kirill goes down there. Corey visits Antarctica himself in January of 2017. He says that he was taken down there, and he says he saw at first hand these buried artifacts from the lost Antarctic civilization, that he got to see them at first hand, and he had some artists come up with some graphics of what he had seen. So he says he was taken there aboard this craft that belongs to one of the inner Earth groups called the Anshar. He says that these are the bodies of the hybrids that were created by the Martian colonists or the Martian refugees, that these are the hybrids. Over here are the ongoing scientific excavations of the artifacts under the ice shell, that they're all over the place. And that so he could see those scientific excavations going on, and he's been saying for some time now that this is going to be part of a soft disclosure initiative, that they're slowly leaking out information about Antarctica, such as vast cavern systems that are thermally heated to like 25 degrees, that's part of the soft disclosure initiative to prepare the public for impending announcements that they found lost cities or artifacts under the Antarctic ice shelf. So this is Corey's description of what these bodies look like. He's described some of them as being like chimera, so there's been a lot of genetic experimentation down there in Antarctica that was conducted by this kind of old, or this buried civilization. But all dead, kind of like in Pompeii, rather than being kind of perfectly preserved by volcanic ash, they're perfectly preserved through the ice, by the ice that had been there. But this has recently melted. The thermal activity has increased, kind of melting the ice, exposing all of this stuff, which is why so many nations are now drilling furiously into the interior of Antarctica, because they want to get a piece of what's happening down there. Now, of course, 2016, that name that shouldn't be mentioned gets elected President of the United States. Right? And he sends an emissary down to Antarctica. Again, look, they're going to see all the penguins. Everyone loves penguins. So Newt Gingrich is a close confidant of that man. And he was sent down there as an emissary to kind of like start the negotiations. After all, Trump wrote The Art of the Deal, right? So it's like, okay, we'll make a deal with these guys down there. Everyone can make a deal, right? So he's making a deal. Well, a very interesting development is, guess who this person is?
It's not his wife,
it is his wife, yeah, it's his wife, yeah. Guess what position she was appointed to? Not long after this. Penguin keeper? Close. She is the US ambassador to the Vatican. Okay? So deals are being made. I think it's not Celeste, it sounds like Celeste. Not Cecile. It'll come to... Caliente?
Kelly Gingrich.
It's Callista Gingrich, that's right, Callista. So she is now the US ambassador to the Vatican. So now Trump comes in, and so inauguration, he is now President of the United States, we can mention him. And he, in his inauguration speech, he says something towards the end, which is quite amazing, really. You read that. It's like, well, I mean, if he was such an idiot, how could he be saying these things? I mean, who's really behind him? Who's pulling the strings? You know, if this stuff is something that feels that he's gonna shepherd into the public realm, it's like he must have some pretty powerful people working with him. So, who are they? We'll talk about that pretty soon. Only a few days after he becomes president, he signs a secret presidential memorandum to declassify some advanced technologies, anti-aging and free energy technology. I mean, who would have thought that anti-aging is real? That in probably 10 years' time, if you have your $20 million, you can be reverted back to your 25-year-old self. That this kind of technology exists. So he issues this secret memorandum to basically have a lot of patents in the United States that have been frozen in the application process because of national security orders, or that these national security orders, they're issued when any of the major intelligence organisations or the military services say that issuing a patent would be a threat to national security. So there have been, guess how many patents have been withheld under national security orders? Anyone want to guess? How many?
3,000.
Well, the closer figure is 4,800. That's officially, that have been withheld under national security orders. So that's 4,800 inventions that span the spectrum of things that can improve the quality of human life that have been withheld under national security orders. This memorandum basically dictated that 1,200 of these had to be released within 2 years. So now we've just passed the 1 year level, a 1 year mark, and we'll soon start seeing if this is happening. Okay, so the big question is, will he disclose Antarctica to start an economic boom? Because he's all about making America great again and building the economy and getting as many Americans back to work as possible. So starting up an economic boom by releasing the existence of advanced technologies, that's certainly something he's indicated in terms of his inauguration speech, in terms of that secret memorandum to have patents fast-tracked to be released that have been previously held up under national security orders. And so he wants to start up an economic boom with having new technologies come online. So he really wants to re-industrialise America. He feels that America's gone through a period of deindustrialisation where the vast manufacturing capacity is now a shadow of what it once was. I mean, you walk into an American Walmart store and, try and find the Made in America product in a Walmart store. It's impossible. If you go in intentionally, like, I don't want to buy Chinese because, they do terrible things in Tibet or whatever. It's like you can't find anything else that's not made in China. Walmart is really just China, China incorporated. So he wants to make America great again, and he's wanting to release these technologies. So the big thing is, who's behind him? I mean, if he's not an idiot, if he's not a buffoon, and there's some powerful forces that are using him as a puppet, who are they? Anyone like to guess? Big corporations? No, they're with the other side.
Military.
That's it, the military. Trump is backed by the US military. This is on his Twitter page this morning, okay? It just shows the level to which he is enamoured with the US military. He actually, he went to military school. I mean, his kind of elementary high school was at a military prep college. So even though he never joined the military, he was raised in that. So for him, he just feels very, very comfortable around military people. And when you look at his cabinet, when you look at the senior officials in his administration, his Secretary of Defence, James Mattis, is a 4-star Marine general. His Chief of Staff, former Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly, is a 4-star Marine General. Hugh McMaster, his National Security Advisor, is a 3-star Army General. The head of the Secret Service is a 2-star Marine General. And so it goes on and on and on. Mike Rogers, the head of the NSA, is a 4-star Navy Admiral. So his administration is dominated by the US military because they are the ones that are behind him. And Trump's kind of like a very convenient kind of magic act in a way, because in a way he acts the buffoon, making all these tweets, getting people kind of like, you know, focused on, you know, who's he called an a-hole now, you know? And so people are distracted by that, but the left hand is doing all the damage, where the military are going around and doing all of these things, and that's what I'm going to get into next. So this executive order, you know, many people kind of like have been very skeptical about this whole idea, well, you know, can Trump really be a figurehead for the military, really be a figurehead for the white hats in the kind of military-industrial complex, wanting to clean up the country and get America moving again? Well, if you had any doubts, you know, this should dispel them. This executive order that was issued on December 21, 2017, just read that. Okay, so he's declared that there is a serious human rights abuse and corruption occurring all around the planet, and that constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States security. Well, if you think about that, it's like, well, haven't human rights abuses and international corruption been endemic? What's so different now? Why is the US now saying that this is an extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy and economy of the United States? What's going down? What's really happening here? And I hereby declare a national emergency to deal with the threat. So now in the United States, the various bureaucracies are forced to cooperate with the US military and other Department of Treasury, Departments of State to enforce this executive order. And this executive order basically freezes the worldwide assets of anyone involved in human rights abuse or corruption anywhere around the planet. He's basically not just cleaning up the deep swamp in the United States, he's cleaning up the deep swamp around the planet. He's going after the elite. They're going after the global elite. And there's no way Trump could do this on his own. None at all, not a chance. He is working with these guys, with the military. They are the ones, they're the real power at the moment, and they've kind of won the secret war. Corey Goode has been talking for a few years. Actually, many others have been talking about a war between the white hats and the kind of transnational corporate conglomerates around the planet, or the cabal, global elite, whatever you want to talk about, however you want to phrase them. But by issuing this executive order and now targeting the assets, the lifeblood of the global elite, it's like this is a declaration of war. And this is what's happening now. Right now, as we speak, the global elite, the big fish, are being detained or hunted by US Special Forces that are fully authorised under this executive order to go anywhere around the planet to hunt these guys down. Anyone involved in these kinds of human rights abuses, international corruption, which, you know, under the language of the executive order, constitutes a grave national security threat to the United States. They're hunting these people down. You know, that's the scene from Eyes Wide Shut. I mean, how many of you watched that Eyes Wide Shut? How many of you have seen that? Well, I think many of you, like me, probably had that sick feeling watching this stuff, that sick feeling of powerlessness. Well, these guys are now having their day. They're being arrested, detained. So that's what's going on now with them. And that kind of like, so there's war. I mean, it's undeclared. So this kind of brings me back full circle now to what happened in Hawaii this morning. These guys are behind it. I think these guys are behind it. They did it because they're basically threatening the US at the moment, and it's like, well, you know, if you don't pull back, we're going to get our attack dog, which is North Korea, to come after you. But it's a pretty desperate card to play, but that's what they're doing. And I think this was their threat. Now, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think North Korea is going to do this. The Chinese are keeping close eye on North Korea. They don't want the US to obliterate the North Korean infrastructure because they know what would happen. The US would kind of come in, and so they don't want that. So I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be an empty threat, but still, I think that shows that they still have some power, and they're trying to impose their threats. So this brings me to the final slide, which is really a kind of summary of everything I've discussed today. It's quite a complex thing, but we have plenty of time for questions. But let me just kind of like quickly go through it so that it's kind of summarising, you know, many of the things I've said today. In the 1920s, the Vril Society were the first ones to begin developing prototype spacecraft. That kind of like led to the Nazis coming along and co-opting a lot of this and building their own program. That led to the German Antarctic space program. But this program, this Vril Society program, continued, and I think this involved Maria Orsic and her kind of more positive group. And it also involved the positive group emerging out of fascist Italy. That fascist Italy, under Mussolini in 1933, began a flying saucer program. You know, there are documents that actually prove that or show that. Then 1938, there was a breakaway Italian secret space program that went to South America. That Giuliano Marconi headed that, and he faked his death, went down to South America because he didn't want to have anything to do with the war effort. He was more a pacifist, even though he had set up his company in Britain. And he was appointed by Mussolini to head up the Italian flying saucer program. He didn't want to have anything to do with the coming war. So he took as many people, as many resources as he could out of Europe and took it down to South America to set up a kind of more peaceful scientific space program. So he teamed up with Orsic down there, and I think these guys were the ones behind the contactee movement, or at least some of it. Not all of it. I think maybe there were, you know, some of the contactees did have genuine extraterrestrial experiences, but others were really meeting up with people that were coming out of this program. We've already talked about the Dark Fleet, the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate. That was where the German corporations essentially worked with the American corporations to build this vast corporate space program under the Antarctic ice. 1942, you have the Los Angeles air raid incident. That's when the US Army Air Force, the US Navy began cooperating with Douglas Aircraft Company, which was the company that William Tompkins worked for 13 years later, who talked a lot about Douglas's involvement in this secret space program evolution. So essentially what happened was 1942, you have the LA air raid incident. The American military and Douglas Corporation, they began to kind of brainstorm, well, you know, how do these technologies work? Because this was anti-gravity technology that was used in that incident. So they formed this kind of informal study group that evolved by October of 1945, you have Project RAND being formed in the Douglas Aircraft Company. Then 3 years later, in 1948, there's a separation that the Douglas Aircraft Company's involvement in Project RAND came to an end. So Project RAND splits off and forms the RAND Corporation, which is fully sponsored and supported by the US Air Force. So they fund their space program, completely separate program. 1970s, they've developed orbital space platforms with all sorts of technologies that they have in place, and so they're ready to use that against North Korea at this very moment. They've got space platforms up there with all sorts of kind of rods of God, microwave technologies, all sorts of futuristic weapon systems that they're prepared to use against North Korea if they're given the go-ahead. And they'll take out North Korea's infrastructure within hours rather than weeks, which is what happened with the Kosovo-Serbia campaign, or with what happened in Iraq. That took several weeks to degrade the weapons systems of Serbia and of Iraq. Took them weeks to do that. With these aerial space platforms, they can do it within a matter of hours, take out all of North Korea's infrastructure. The Navy develops its own space program in collaboration with Douglas Aircraft Company for well over a decade. 1980s, you have Solar Warden program being developed, being deployed. They have 8 space battle groups. The United Nations also has its program that emerged at the end of the Cold War. And then you have the Russian, the USSR first develops its space program, develops cosmospheres in 1970s. Dr. Peter Beta, some of you may have come across the Peter Beta audio tapes where he talks about the competition or the conflict between the Soviet space program and the Air Force space program. And now you have China. And according to Corey, he says that the Chinese space program is as developed as the American, it's as developed as the Air Force space program. But there's still, all of these guys, well, the Air Force space program, the Chinese space program, are still playing catch up to the Navy space program, and which is playing catch up with these guys, the Dark Fleet and the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate. So that's everything I wanted to present.